Are you taking a major misstep in the management of your business's computers? In this video, I'm going to help you understand the most critical best practices around managing your business's workstations. Hello and welcome to The Prime Concern, a video series that helps you navigate critical IT decisions and use IT services to your advantage. I'm Justin Eckstein, and I bring about 2 decades of IT experience to the table, about half of which has been spent deep in the world of managed IT services. Every business has computers, and those computers are touched every day by your end users and your staff. Are you managing those end user devices properly? Today, I'm going to review some of the most critical pieces that you just can't miss. So let's start with some standard operational best practices. When I talk to small businesses, oftentimes I find that they really don't even have a computer inventory at all. They're just kind of guessing on how many computers they have, or they have to kind of count them up in their head. Oftentimes they don't even really have any readily or easily available reports to review at all. Probably the most critical thing that we need to start with is the basics, and that would be an asset inventory. This could be something as simple as really just a spreadsheet at the end of the day. You don't have to have any special software for this, but we have to at least start with just tracking things like the computers, the tablets, probably the cell phones and other devices that we give employees and that we have purchased and have under management. We need to track things like the device type, the make, the model, when it was purchased, how long we expect it to last, and maybe something like the warranty, and whether or not that warranty should be extended, especially for more critical devices like your network equipment and your servers, if you have those. Oftentimes computers, we don't really necessarily renew the warranty, but it's good to know when those are good through. So just keeping track of the devices and their serial numbers and those basics is a great starting point. And then maybe you can ease into some specialty software. An example of some specialty software would be using something like a remote monitoring and management tool, or for short, we call it an RMM in our industry. There are a lot of them out there, but these tools actually are specialty pieces of software that help manage and monitor devices. So, for example, a computer, an RMM would actually have a little software agent that gets installed on it. And then it takes things like an inventory of all the software and all the hardware details of the computer, who used it last, whether it's online or offline, is it up to date, all this information, and it puts it in a central management dashboard that you can access and log into. So it's secure, but then it also unlocks a lot of other capabilities outside of just an asset inventory list. It also allows us to do things like monitor and check on the performance of the device. So that's kind of another step, is not just having an inventory of the devices, but really truly monitoring them and understanding if they're even performing the way that we expect them to. When we monitor them properly, we can understand if they're having any problems, causing problems for our staff or for our customers. And also it can kind of give us a heads up on maybe when it's time to start thinking about proactively replacing some devices. And then when it comes to actually replacing devices, it's good to have standards and things like standard images of those devices. I know it can be tempting for a small business to simply go and maybe buy the cheapest computer available at like a Best Buy or something like that. But those aren't always the best devices for an actual business to run on. They oftentimes are missing key software and hardware features that you might need from a security best practice. But then also you kind of end up with a whole bunch of different devices in your fleet at that point in time. It can be really kind of hard to manage. Everybody has something different. You might have different software installed and different versions of things. Compatibility becomes a problem. If somebody needs to replace a computer, they might then have trouble with the replacement computer because maybe it's completely different than the one that they had. So enforcing some kind of standard, maybe buying the same kind of computer through the manufacturer and having standard pieces of software that you expect to be on a computer, that can go a long way in just efficiency overall. That also allows you to then unlock things like automated provisioning of a device. So when you have a standard of software that you want to deploy to a computer and maybe a standard piece of hardware, it becomes a little easier to actually automate the deployment of all the software and kind of standardize what that looks like. There's special tools that you can use to actually deploy and manage those devices at that point. And then, of course, as people are using the devices, you also want to make sure that you're able to back up and recover files and those kinds of things on those devices. So you might want to think about where people are storing their files. Is it actually on the computer or is it somewhere else, maybe in a cloud solution? And then what does that look like when somebody actually does lose a file? Are you able to actually recover them or not? I've seen a lot of businesses where they don't really keep track of where their employees are putting their data, and they find that people are going to generally put it wherever you make it the easiest for them. And if that's their computer and you're not backing up the computer, that can be kind of a bad day if that computer just fails and you didn't have a backup of maybe some critical documents that those employees have been working on. So making sure that you really understand how you're backing up the data and how you restore it can be a critical piece in managing the day-to-day of your computers. Next, let's review some best practices around security. I've talked to a few different businesses over the years that have ended up essentially losing a device, or maybe it's gotten stolen, and then they've kind of had to scramble to try and figure out, how do they get it back? How do they track it? Is there a way to remotely wipe the device? And at the end of the day, if you're trying to figure that out after the fact, it's generally too late. You probably don't have the right things in place to track or wipe the device if you didn't think ahead. So we need to just take a holistic approach when managing our computers from a security perspective as well on how we protect against those kinds of situations. One of the first things that we can do, and I know it's not necessarily everybody's favorite thing, is to enforce what we call least privileged access. And really what this means is not letting everybody just have full administrative rights on their computers. That can be the easy thing to do, is to give people admin rights on their computers because they can just kind of install what they need. They're not going to bug you as much. But there's also a lot of risk in doing that because people can install whatever they want. And not just your employees, but also anybody that maybe gains access to that computer, like a hacker, for example. They can use that to deploy things like ransomware and other viruses and spyware, all sorts of keyboard loggers and those kinds of things that we really don't want on our machines. Instead, we can look at some specialty tools that actually allow us to restrict access on the computers, but maybe provide them the ability to update or install the software that's approved for your business. Something that goes along with that would be really enforcing and standardizing your endpoint protection. I know it kind of might seem a little obvious, but a lot of businesses out there really don't do that. And they really don't even know what they have in place necessarily. So understanding what you're doing to actually protect your devices and the software on them and how it's getting monitored and updated is pretty critical. Make sure that you understand what's installed, what it's doing, what it's looking for, and what it's doing to actually protect you and your data. The next step, again, it's kind of what you might consider some basic blocking and tackling, but it's actually just patching the devices properly and making sure that you're managing and monitoring that on a regular basis. It's something that gets missed all of the time, and it's generally fairly easy to do. Probably the biggest challenge when it comes to making sure the computers are up to date is that a lot of people might want to slam their laptop shut at the end of the day when they go home, and then the computers aren't on overnight, and so it can be hard for them to get patches after hours. So having some kind of standard on how those patches get deployed and making sure that your staff understands how that works so that they can actually help the patches go through, and then it's less of an issue for them the next working day. They don't have patches interrupting them when they're actually trying to get stuff done. Another item to consider is disk encryption, and this is one of those things. This is kind of why you need to make sure that you're buying an actual enterprise grade device and not just going to a place like a Best Buy or the computer store down the street. You need to make sure that you purchase a business grade computer that actually is able to do what we call disk encryption. Now, what disk encryption is it's the actual hard drive in the computer where you store your files and everything. But what disk encryption does is it kind of scrambles it up in a way so that not anybody can get the files off of that hard drive. If you have an encrypted hard drive, that means that if I were to steal your computer, I couldn't get the information off of it without knowing what the password is to the machine. Without disk encryption, I could quite literally just steal a machine and take the hard drive out, and I can plug it in somewhere else and get all the information out of it, and I don't need a password at all. So there's things like that we need to think about when securing our data, because inevitably there's stuff that's going to get stored on there that's sensitive. We want to protect it the best we can. And one other thing to consider would be things like log collection. You might not really think about that with a computer, but things like the antivirus or the endpoint protection on there, and if people are putting files on there, if the device were to get stolen or lost, or maybe you had a breach of some kind, having some kind of logs collected, generally by like a cybersecurity firm, maybe they're monitoring the antivirus, that can be really handy later on, generally after the fact, after something's happened, to understand what happened, how did they get in there, what did they do, so that we can make sure that we really have a good holistic understanding of how to fix this permanently in the case that something like that happened. And last but not least, it's great to put all these things in place, but we also need to actually have some kind of compliance check in place where we're actually making sure that this stuff is happening, not just we set it up the one time and then we cross our fingers and we hope that it's going to be like that the whole lifespan of the computer. We need to actually make sure that we're doing things like vulnerability scanning on the machine to make sure that none of these things got turned off or disabled or they broke. We need to make sure that we're actually monitoring these things and understanding whether or not they're actually doing what they should be doing the whole time that we have the computer out there. I know I've ran into a number of instances where we've been talking to a small business and they say they have these things in place, or they're supposed to have these things in place, and maybe they have a policy written around it. But then we go to look at it and we find, well, it got turned off maybe when they were troubleshooting something and nobody realized it was turned off, or it was just misconfigured or just never turned on to begin with. And that can be a huge blow because when you think about things like cyber insurance and just the general risk out there, if you don't turn these things on, or you think they're turned on, that can be a real problem. Maybe things like cyber insurance won't actually pay you, in the event of a breach because you weren't doing the things that you said or thought you were doing. They expect you to actually do these things. So we need to make sure that we have ways to actually review all these controls that are in place. Next, let's review how we empower users while still maintaining some sense of control. So at the end of the day, we can put all these security things in place, but we still need to be able to get our jobs done. So there's a little bit of a balance there. We need it to be easy enough that we can still do our day-to-day without feeling like we're interrupted or being watched by Big Brother. But we also need to make sure that our business is secure, our data is secure, and our employees aren't necessarily going to harm themselves or our business accidentally. We can start by just training. At the end of the day, making sure that our employees understand the risks that are out there and why we're doing the things that we're doing. It's critical. I've talked about it before, but things like email, that we're giving our employees access to the world and really opening up a lot of risk to our business. People need to understand, when they're clicking links within emails, what the risks that are that are there, as well as just when saving things to your computer, and all of the things that go around that. We need to just understand what's out there and why we're trying to put things in place. It can really reduce questions. It can reduce a lot of fatigue when people understand what's supposed to be happening and why things are the way they are. We also can do things like implement single sign-on. This is a really big one, something that I think a lot of businesses have been able to take advantage of, especially with the move to the cloud. But having the same username and password, or the credentials being the same as your computer, as well as some of the critical business apps that you use, can really make things a lot easier, but also more secure at the end of the day. Allows us to enforce a lot of different kinds of controls behind the scenes and make sure that we're looking at not only is this a business grade computer, but it's actually our computer and one that we should be using, and it's got all the right controls in place. That can all kind of happen in the background while we're making it easy for the end user to log in and do what they need to do. We can also do things like define and actually enforce acceptable use policies. That kind of goes back to the training thing a little bit, but it helps, I think, our employees and our staff understand what we're trying to accomplish and why we're trying to do these things and what's expected. When people understand what's expected of them and what's expected of the business, there's really a lot less confusion. People are just going to be able to really hop on the bandwagon a lot faster and understand, yeah, I get it. That's what we got to do. And there's fewer roadblocks that way. Things can just be smoother while still having some sense of control there. We can also do things like take advantage of some of the cloud storage and collaboration tools out there. That allows us to not only unlock some flexibility for our employees, but also we can integrate those with things like our workstations from a backup and ease of use perspective. So some of the cloud storage tools out there, for example, allow us to actually sync things like the desktop and the My Documents, places where people might store files without even thinking about it, and allows us to actually kind of sync and back that up to a cloud storage utility. It makes it easier for an employee to actually just get their job done, but then also it kind of helps reduce some risk because we're actually removing the element of maybe that workstation failing at the end of the day and moving that data somewhere that we can manage it and back it up. We can also look at, remote work options. When we're talking about computers and workstations, they don't necessarily have to be physical devices. We can look at things like virtual desktops and hosting those in the cloud and kind of reworking where we put our data and how we're working with it. So keep in mind that there are other technologies out there that we can potentially leverage and maybe shift some of the workloads around. It also kind of changes how you pay for these devices and budgeting and that kind of thing. But there are some things that we can do there from a remote work perspective that we can make things easier on our employees, but also maintain some control around the data. One thing to consider too with remote work would be things like personal devices. I've kind of seen an uptick of that as of late, where when people want to work from home or just be more flexible, they start to use maybe a personal laptop for work. There's a lot of risk involved with that. It's important to, in my opinion, make sure that employees are always using actual work-provided devices for work tasks. It's because you're going to end up with, potentially sensitive information on those devices. So if you think about maybe client information, or maybe you're working with HIPAA data or government data or just sensitive financial information, it's easy for that information to land on the desktop of maybe somebody's personal device that they're using. And then it can sync into their OneDrive or their Google Documents or what have you. Maybe their children use that device and they play games on there and they can access that information. There's a lot of risk there that you can potentially expose yourself and your clients to. So it's generally best to make sure that people are using actually work provided devices, because then you can also secure them and monitor that data and ensure that it's not getting where it shouldn't be. I think the key thing to understand when it comes to your business's computers are that they're easy to overlook when considering the overall security architecture of your network, but they still play a key role and often can be hard to get a handle on. We need to be diligent in the policies that we develop and also the ways that we enforce and track them. Thanks for watching today's video. If you would like to learn more, click the link in the description.